jump to 703. Let's go backwards. 703, presentation of fiscal year 18, budget planning, process of preliminary schools, consolidation, recommendation of community engagement plan. I'm going to recognize Ms. Rebecca Kemp.
Thank you, Vice Chair Ellis, members of the board, Superintendent Laura. I wish that the first time I was standing at this podium were to bring you happier news. But as you heard from Jean's budget presentation and our superintendent's update today, we have some hard facts that we're looking at for our FY18 budget. To recap, we're anticipating an additional $4 to $10 million in cuts for next year, and we do think that this reduced funding level is likely our new reality, that any state funding increases that are being discussed in the legislature will probably be allocated to teacher raises, and that money would not be able to go to support our operating expenses. Many of the cuts that we made for last year in that $30 million were targeted cuts or additional revenues that are not sustainable, like the textbooks that you guys have talked about this evening, library media budgets, elementary school and fine arts supplies, and athletic equipment. And as Board Member Hammock alluded to, those buckets of cuts that we're looking at, if we don't make some serious changes, are things that, as our last presentation showed us, are things that are really, really critical to the success of our students, and that we really don't want to go there. So the conclusion that we drew from these facts is that we have to seek permanent cost savings through considering reducing the number of schools that we operate. So how did we get to the presentation that you see tonight? A cross-functional team of staff looked at kind of the case for class and school mergers. Consolidating schools and classes can lead to permanent cost reduction because you reduce the administration, utilities, custodial, and staff costs. You also see from this that when we're looking at, for example, 3 schools with 1 6th grade class each, when we can consolidate those into one school, that you would have 1 school with 2 classes and a larger student body of 6th graders. The estimated cost savings for closing 1 elementary school, these are kind of the fixed costs for how much it is to operate a school, no matter how many kids are in it, is about $242,710. That is budget savings for the principal's salary and benefits, the school secretary's salary and benefits, utilities and waste management, and custodial services. So the implications for what this looks like when we're operating our schools, when you look at those fixed costs, which we're rounding up to about $250,000 for savings for 1 school, the 200 student school, the fixed cost means that we're spending about $1,250 per student on just running the building, keeping the doors open for those 200 students. If we have 500 students in the school, those fixed costs reduce to about $500 per student. And even if you include the fact that the 500 student school earns an additional assistant principal, it still costs us $660 per student for the administration of that school. So the larger school, we're spending more of our money on stuff that's going into the classroom to support kids instead of spending it on administration and facility costs. So larger schools also provide more opportunities for students because they earn additional support positions like counselors, specials teachers like your PE and fine arts. That 200 student school gets a counselor 1 day a week and no assistant principal. The 500 student school earns half of a counselor 2.5 days a week and an assistant principal. So here are some of our sample staffing ratios for elementary schools. A myth that people talk about sometimes when we think about small schools is that small schools and small classes are the same, and that's not true necessarily. We staff all of our schools at the same level, regardless of the number of students that are in them. So we do have, in some cases, schools that only have 1 class of a particular grade level, and we may have, for example, 8 6th graders in a class and 1 teacher teaching those 8 students. But all of our schools are staffed on the same levels, regardless of the number of students that are in them. And as you can see, a school needs to reach that 451 mark to earn an assistant principal, and they earn those PE and fine arts teachers based on the total number of classrooms of teachers that are in the building. So the filters that we applied when we looked at our schools for thinking about which ones would be candidates for consolidation, we looked at enrollment trends, the capacity of the facilities and the condition of the facilities, and we also looked at the capacity of neighboring schools where the kids might be able to go instead. So other guiding principles that we took into consideration in terms of the things that you'll see reflected in the decisions that we are recommending tonight is that we only considered reassigning kids within the same high school feeder pattern. So we did not make any recommendations that would move students from one middle school or high school to another middle school or high school. Where possible, we reassigned all the students to the same school to make that transition easier because the kids would all be moving together with their friends and other families in their neighborhood. We also considered 300 to kind of be the minimum size for a school. And our preference is for our schools to make it past that 450 mark to earn additional support positions, but 300 is the minimum size. We also tried to respect factors unique to neighborhoods, and you'll see a few of those mentioned through the course of the detailed recommendation. So when we applied these focus criteria for the 2017-18 plan, we looked at schools with fewer than 300 students. There are 12 schools in the district currently that are serving fewer than 300 students. 3 of those are below 200. Those schools are Edgemere, Gatewood, and Johnson. We also looked at classes and grade levels, particularly 5th and 6th grades, where we had either low enrollment and single classes or some overcrowding where we could move the class and get some additional support for the kids by moving them to the middle school. So this is what the map of the district looks like when you apply those focus criteria. The schools that are circled in green are below 300. The ones in yellow are below 200. So that our below 200 schools are Johnson, Edgewood, and Gatewood, Edgemere and Gatewood. The schools below 300 are Northeast, Parks, Edwards, Spencer, Rogers, Green Pastures, Telstar, Pierce, and Oak Ridge. Now, before we dig into the actual recommendations for grade consolidations, as we looked at the schools on the south side of the district, we found quickly that the schools that are next door to them don't have space to take the students. So we are not at this time recommending changes to Oak Ridge or Pierce due to lack of capacity in neighboring schools. We also have been meeting with the Northeast Task Force. As you all know, this is a diverse group of community stakeholders that Superintendent Laura convened over the course of 7 weeks between January and March. They looked at declining performance and enrollment in the schools in District 5 and reviewed research and best practices to make recommendations for how we might reinvest funds into some school turnaround efforts in Douglas and Star Spencer. Now, we want to make sure that people are aware that the task force did not make specific school site recommendations, but there are a couple of things reflected here that you'll see related to the Northeast Task Force, so we wanted you to know that they did recommend that we consider rethinking the mid-high structure at Douglas, and a recommendation that they made that we do plan on implementing district-wide is to convene a repurposing committee for the facilities so we can make sure to be good neighbors in the communities and use our buildings for positive community uses.
And let me just jump in to say I'm going to be meeting with the Northeast Task Force later this week to get their thoughts on what type of supports they would like to see in their school if we're able to reinvest some savings. So I just want to be clear that they did not make the recommendation of these closures. These come from the administration, and that we are going to be having meetings with them and hearing their thoughts around how do we better support the schools. But I want to just be clear that this should not be pinned on anyone on the Northeast Task Force. This is the recommendation of our administration at this time.
Thanks. So let's start off by focusing on the grade level moves that we're recommending. First, with 6th graders, we are consolidating the 6th grade at Stand Watie to Roosevelt Middle School. We moved several other 6th grades to Roosevelt last year with some success, and Roosevelt has capacity to take the 6th graders at Stand Watie. We also are planning to consolidate the 6th grades at 7 elementary schools in the Northwest class and feeder pattern into Taft Middle School. Those schools are Cleveland, and the 6th graders from Wilson attend Cleveland, Eugene Field, Gatewood, Hawthorne, Linwood, Putnam Heights, and Sequoia. And that will put 167 students in the 6th grade at Taft. We're also recommending that we consolidate 5th graders in the Star Spencer cluster at Rogers Middle School. It's these 4 elementary schools: Green Pastures, Spencer, Telstar, and Willowbrook. Currently, Willowbrook is approaching being overcrowded, and they don't really have space for their 5th grade, so moving their 5th grade made a lot of sense. And so we want to move the 5th graders in the rest of the cluster to Rogers, and this recommendation does put Rogers above the 300 mark. So in terms of what students kind of get out of this move, the students, we believe, will benefit from departmentalized instruction. That's sort of the difference between what 6th grade looks like in elementary school versus middle school. They get specialized teachers. The 6th graders will be able to access middle school athletics and extracurriculars. Our 5th graders will be able to access the PAL athletic program. And Rogers Middle School is projected to gain an additional counselor and an assistant principal by adding the additional students. So next, the school consolidations. This, I'm going to bring us back to this map. We'll be kind of honing in on different portions of this map to go through feeder pattern by feeder pattern what our recommendations are to bring our schools up above 300. The first is the Northwest class and feeder pattern, and Gatewood is the school in this area that we that met our focus criteria. Gatewood Statistics, their projected enrollment for next year is 168 students. That's grades pre-K to 6, well, pre-K to 5, I think, once we move the students to Taft. And 39% of those students are from out of the zone. Right now, Gatewood has 112 in-zone students enrolled in the school. We are recommending that we close Gatewood Elementary School and reassign the students to Eugene Field. Eugene Field would be projected to be at 580 students if we consolidate the 2 buildings together. The benefits for students of this are that each grade level would have at least 3 classrooms and teachers. That gives the teachers some ability to collaborate and plan with their colleagues and do some professional learning together. The students would have additional access to a counselor, additional specials teachers. Right now, Gatewood has half a PE teacher and half an art teacher. And the students would also have access to an assistant principal, a full-time media specialist, and an office clerk. The Douglas feeder pattern is the next one that we looked at. There are 4 schools in this geographical area that met our criteria: Edgemere, Northeast Academy, Parks, and Edwards. First, we'll look at Northeast. Northeast is not currently a neighborhood school. It's a magnet program that enrolls students in grades 6 through 12 through a choice application process. Northeast is projected to enroll 241 students next year in grades 6 through 12. That's 77 middle schoolers and 164 high schoolers. Through the process of the discussions with the Northeast Task Force and thinking about what it would look like to have a middle school in the Douglas cluster, we think that the Northeast facility would be the best one to do that. And so we're proposing that Northeast Academy transition to becoming a neighborhood middle school, serving grades 5 through 8 in the Douglas feeder pattern. So the students who are currently in 5th and 6th grades at Parks, Moon, King, Edwards, and Edgemere would move to Northeast. The current middle school students at Northeast would stay there, and the students who were in grades 7 and 8 at Douglas would move there. The Northeast Middle School is projected to earn 2 assistant principals and 2 counselors, as well as a full-time media specialist and half of a clerk. Douglas High School is projected to have 477 students in grades 9 through 12, and it will continue to earn 2 assistant principals and 2 counselors. I also heard earlier today that it may increase their level of competition in athletics, so it might be a positive thing for those students as well to move into the quadruple A category. Edgemere is the next building that we looked at. Edgemere is projected next year to have 195 students enrolled. Based on their current enrollment, there are 113 neighborhood students enrolled at Edgemere, and about 40% of their kids are coming from out of their school zone. This is a school that has a unique situation with the community school pilot that's located there, and that's something that we took into consideration in these recommendations. We also looked at FD Moon. Moon is a larger school. It has 454 projected for next year, and a relatively smaller number of transfers than the other schools that you've seen. But the condition of this facility is such that it makes it the logical choice for closure. The building was built in the 60s and hasn't had any major renovations. It was planned for closure previously. And the neighboring schools both have under 300 students, and the education environments are more modern, and we've invested money into Parks and Edwards in recent years. So we're recommending that we close Moon and Edgemere and reassign the students to Edwards, King, and Parks. The Edgemere students go to King. The Moon students are divided between Parks and Edwards. The grades 5 through 8, of course, go to Northeast, and Douglas houses grades 9 through 12. So implications for students of this one, the ratios for counselors, media specialists, increase at all the schools. We do plan as well to relocate the community school pilot, including the community engagement coordinator position, to King in order to provide access to that program for more students. So the program that currently is serving in the 190 ballpark of 190 students would be accessible to 500 students at King. King also will earn an assistant principal and an office clerk and a full-time media specialist. The John Marshall feeder pattern is the next one that we looked at. John Marshall is home to Johnson, which is currently right around 200 students. It's projected to have 203 students for next year, and their current enrollment reflects 102 neighborhood students attending the school and 113 transfers. That's a little over half of the students are coming from outside the school zone. We recommend that we close Johnson and reassign those students to Ridgeview Elementary. And the implications of this for students, most of the village, with the exception of the small part of the village that's zoned to Western Village, would be zoned into the same school. They would have increased counselor allocations, an office clerk. We did want to make sure that everyone was aware that for the schools, and Johnson isn't the only one that has special education self-contained units, we will be going through our annual process to assign those units and make sure that they are going to a place that's appropriate. And the teachers and the services will go with the students to the location that they're able to go. We're just not sure yet exactly what the best facility will be to house those classes. Johnson, because of the large number of transfers there, we are working on figuring out what a process will look like to make sure that the students that are currently transferred into Johnson will have kind of first opportunity to take advantage of transfer seats available in the John Marshall cluster, so that if there isn't enough space at Ridgeview for all of them, that they do have another choice option within the cluster. Star Spencer feeder pattern is the last one that we looked at. Star Spencer area has 4 schools right now that are below 300. Rogers, we increased the size of that school through the 5th grade consolidation, so it will be above 300. Spencer, Green Pastures, and Telstar are the elementary schools that we focused on in this part of the presentation. Green Pastures is the school that it made the most sense to be a candidate for closure. It currently is at about 7% transfers, and next year is projected to have 296 kids. This facility is the smallest one of the 3 that were kind of options, and it is sort of geographically in the middle, so it was maybe a little easier to draw the lines to zone the students to the other schools. And we're recommending that the students from Green Pastures be split between Spencer and Telstar Elementaries, and that we draw the boundary there at 36th Street. The implications for students here, they both have an increase in their counselor allocation, and Spencer grows enough to earn a half-time media specialist, an office clerk, and additional specials teachers, so that's PE and fine arts. So here's our kind of general overview of everything that I just said. The students at Edgemere would be zoned to King Elementary School, and the community school pilot would be relocated. The Gatewood students go to Eugene Field. Green Pastures go to Spencer and Telstar. Johnson goes to Ridgeview. Moon goes to Edwards and Parks. Northeast Academy becomes a 5 to 8 middle school. The high school students return to their home schools or select from other options. We do have academies at other schools that have the same themes as the ones that are currently at Northeast. So students that want to continue in those pathways will be able to facilitate that for them. And Douglas should be here as well. It becomes a 9 through 12 high school. So with sort of this recommendation as a package, we would end up with all but 3 of our schools above 300. The 3 remaining schools being Telstar, Pierce, and Oak Ridge. And those schools are relatively close to 300. They're in the 275 to 290 range. The recommended total budget savings for this recommendation closing 5 schools is about $1.2 million. And so we are very interested in hearing from our community about these recommendations. It is something that is painful for everyone, and I know no one wants their school to close, but we are planning informational meetings, one at each of the affected schools. We wanted to make sure that the meetings were accessible to all of our families, regardless of their and we know that some people have transportation challenges. So each of these meetings will be the same. So if people are not able to come to the one that's at the school in their neighborhood, they're welcome to come to any and all of these meetings that will occur between this Thursday and next Wednesday. So with that, Superintendent Laura and I are happy to take questions.
And so just to clarify, this at this time is a proposal. March 30th is the day that I will take it to the board as an information item. So that's why all 6 of those meetings are happening within the next week. They are all happening scheduled before we make a final recommendation and bring it to the board for information. Then we are calling a special board meeting for April 6th, which is when the vote will be.
I would like to make a recommendation just on the books. You have Johnson down there for March 23rd. I'd like to see that move to a later date because I'm not going to be in town. And from my understanding, I would just like to be at Johnson's because you're not comparing apples to apples with that school, and there's a reason why, and I just want to be a part of it.
Yep.
So
We can look at that.
if you could look at that
Yeah,
and just let me know.
We'll look at seeing if we can make that adjustment.
Okay.
One of the things that concerns me in speaking from history is more so when we're talking about the 5th grade through the 8th grade. I know that a few years ago there was conversation even when we were talking about moving our 6th grades into the middle school, and there were lots of legitimate concerns as far as the maturity level, as far as security, for these students being able to maintain with the upper class people. They're upperclassmen, and so anyway, it was not favorable, the comments that I had received, and then we're thinking about even to bringing in a lower level. That brings me even further concern, and more so the fact, and I understand, what's going on and what you're trying to accomplish, and if it is the desire of the board, I would say that for the staff to, by all means, to make sure that these students are in separate, proximity from others. I know that you put up here with Rogers, and I know that Rogers has 2 separate levels. And so in my mind's eye, it would say that it would make more sense for a 5th and a 6th grader to be on a different or separate level from their upperclassmen. So while we are making these types of decisions and thinking about it, if we can keep all of these types of things in consideration. Another area is that where we were talking about with with Telstar and with Green Pastures if they were to close, and that the boundaries that part would go to Telstar and part would go to Spencer Elementary. Again, that it was a couple of years or so ago that there was a boundary change, and that the purpose of that boundary change was for the safety of the children and a loss of the areas that they would have to cross. There's a busy 23rd Street, there's a train track, there's a one-way tunnel that goes through, and so making sure that we have all of that information before we, even as a board, even consider those types of changes.
Thank you.
So this is under reports and presentations. What's your next step coming to the board?
So the next step is we've got currently 6 scheduled community meetings, and we're going to open up a survey before I take it to the board for information on March 30th, which is a Thursday at a called meeting that we have scheduled. Then we will most likely, once the proposal has been final and goes to board for information, schedule a few more follow-up community meetings in case there are some changes but between now and when I bring it to the board. We'll schedule a few more for the board to also come and listen, and then the board will vote on April 6th at a special called meeting. So we have the next step is right now people should come out to the 6 community meetings or fill out our survey online. I'm taking feedback, and at this point, we'll be making a final recommendation to our board on March 30th.